Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. I'm your host, Ian C. I'm glad you could be watching or listening to this, whether you're listening on iTunes or Spotify or watching it here. Again, I'm just glad you're tuning in. A couple of things at the front end that I really wanted to clarify before I get into the substance of the show, and that is that we have changed the name slightly. It used to just be Cereal for Dinner, and of course I'd say podcast because it's technically a podcast, but it wasn't called podcast. But now it's actually called Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. And unfortunately I had to change it because there was another podcast called Cereal for Dinner. And what I did originally when I thought of this show was, the idea of growing up Generation X, and just growing up. I don't know. There are many times where cereal was what I had for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and it's a quick, easy meal. Sitting in front of the TV, eating cereal for dinner. Not that that happened, all the time or anything like that, but it's a common thing. And then plus, as a young adult, a lot of what I ate was cereal for dinner because it was cheap and easy, and just didn't have to bug with it that much. But the deal is I typed both before I started the podcast and the YouTube channel. I typed into YouTube and I typed into Google cereal for dinner, and things came up. Obviously, one of the things came up was like diet stuff. Like one of them was like follow me as I go. As you see a full day of eating, and there were different things, but there wasn't really anything that I saw, at least immediately, called cereal for dinner or like a podcast or anything like that. So I just went ahead and launched it. But unfortunately, there is a podcast called Cereal for Dinner, and they haven't done anything on that podcast for about 4 years now. But I don't know the law, and I didn't want to hire a lawyer and ask and all that stuff. So I just changed it to Some Cereal for Dinner. I've never listened to the podcast. When I found out that there was a podcast, I listened to about 3 or 4 minutes of it, and it didn't seem like it was even close to the same thing that I do. And I looked on just kind of on Google, like, what do you do when somebody has the same name you have? And it said like there's technically no laws against it, but you never know, and somebody could file a claim, and and like you can have books the same title, and you can also have like movies of the same title. There's two movies called Serenity. But I know you can't have two bands by the same title, because I know that there was a band before Nirvana called Nirvana, and there was actually two bands, and one of them sued and was kind of and somewhat successful. I don't know if they settled out of court or not, but they were, to a degree successful. And then the other one didn't. But I know that you can't have two bands by the same name, and I don't know even the legalities of whether or not you can have two books by the same name or two movies. Like I know that there are more movies than just that share titles. But like I don't know if they had to pay or something like that, and I just really wasn't interested in finding out the hard way. So I changed it to Some Cereal for Dinner, which is just reflective of a lot of my growing up years. Some cereal for dinner, and early adult years, and I think just I don't know, reflective of Generation X culture. And so that is why I changed the name slightly. So if you punch in cereal for dinner, still this podcast will come up, but it's technically changed to Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. So there's two extra words in the actual title of this YouTube channel and the title of the podcast that have been changed. So just to let you know that. That's on the front end. What else is going on? Really, not a whole lot else. I'm getting some friends who are interested so that we can maybe do a little bit longer podcast. And one of the friends I'm going to talk to shortly here, we are going to be discussing both. We're going to be discussing like underground music and we're going to be discussing war movies. That's kind of on the horizon. And that brings us to the topic of today, which is probably why you clicked on this, because something in the title about Generation X and the me generation and boomers and what's the difference and Family Ties and 21 Jump Street and how all that ties together. So let me just kind of explain what I want to explain and how it came up for me. Okay, so how it came up for me. So one of the shows that I want to do is I want to do a show on everything cop shows in the 80s and 90s, or Generation X, basically. So I was looking up some police shows and just kind of rewatching them. And one of them that I looked up was 21 Jump Street. And I watched the pilot episode just to kind of get a refresher on it, because I want to talk about everything, like everything cop shows of the 80s, late 70s, 80s, and 90s. And so I looked up 21 Jump Street, because I just, that was a show that I really enjoyed as a kid. And it was one of those new shows that was on a new network called Fox, and I was really interested in what Fox was doing. And it appealed, what they did on that channel really appealed to me. So I started watching it, and as you know, the show, and I'll probably repeat some of this later when I talk about cop shows of the 80s and 90s. But it's the main star of the show really is Tom Hansen, who is the Johnny Depp character. And the show starts out with him being a regular cop and him transitioning into this and looking young and wanting to be taken seriously, and then transitioning into this undercover police job. So I was watching the episode, and he's this, again, like I said, he's this young cop. He wants to do things by the book. Now I know the show changes as it goes on, but he wants to do things by the book, and he wants to be taken seriously, but he looks real young. But he gets himself into some trouble because well, he's just not really that great of a cop in the show, which was kind of funny. And so he goes to this 21 Jump Street precinct, or I don't know exactly how they divide that up, but he goes to this undercover, as we all know the show, these cops who are regular cops, but they look young, and so they go undercover into high schools and bust people for drugs and sex and all kinds of stuff. So murder, yeah, you've seen the show. But what was interesting is the very first person who played the boss, before the guy that we all know who played the boss was the black gentleman. But before that, and I'm not even sure how many episodes into it before it switched, because I watched the pilot and then I switched to episode 8 just because that was the next thing that came up on YouTube. But the first 2 episodes, the boss of the place, and this kind of gets us into this, so follow me here. I'm going to try not to be too scatterbrained, but the boss of the place is this renegade hippie kind of guy. Okay, he's like, yeah, we do things against the establishment here. Really old hippie mentality still, and we don't listen to the man, and we're trying to do the right thing as cops, but we don't, Tom Hansen wants to come in and do a debriefing, and they all laugh at him because he's taking notes, and they're like, you're at 21 Jump Street, man, we don't take notes here. And they really play the fact that this person here is this hippie, this hangover from the hippie era, and he has these hippie ideologies. And one of the things he says to and Tom Hansen, who really wants to play it by the book, you got that kind of formulaic dynamic going in there. It's like, well, he said, one of the lines says, "You sound like a Republican, man," and Tom Hansen, the Johnny Depp character, says, "I am a Republican," and that's supposed to be, well, it's not shocking at the time. That's what was shocking, is at the time that wasn't shocking. And this got me to think about the divide between the end of the boomer generation, the end of that hippie generation, and the beginning of the Generation X. And there's overlap there. Just like there's overlap, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that overlap is. Because that overlap there, and I'll get back to this, that overlap between the end of that hippie era and then the beginning of the Generation X era, before it really became solidly Generation X, that first generation of Generation X and that last little bit generation of the boomer generation was called the me generation. And it was okay at that time to be a Republican, because the Republicans were the party that was, rightly or wrongly, okay, now I'm just saying that rightly or wrongly, were defined as the party of self-interest and the party of it's okay to make money and it's okay to live in excess, which really defined the latter half of the 70s and the first half of the 80s. It's really defined that genre right there. And it was really that end of the hippie era, the last few years of the hippie era, of people who were born in that era, and the first few years of the generation era kind of overlapped to make this generation called the me generation, which basically turned into Generation X for the most part, but we'll get to that in a second. But it's akin to what we call Xennials. Now, a Xennial is somebody who is an in-between between a Generation Xer and a millennial. And they're generally defined by somebody born between 1978 or 9 and 1984. By the time you get to 1984, if you're born in 1984, you're definitely a millennial. But if you're born before that, if you're born in 79, are you a Generation Xer? Are you a millennial? Well, there is this bleed over where they kind of feel comfortable to a certain degree in both worlds, but they're called Xennials. And what's interesting between Xennials and Generation Me is that Generation Me is more pronounced against its previous generation than Xennials. Xennials can kind of like stuff about Generation X, fit into Generation X, and fit into the millennial. Where the Me generation really was conscious of their rebellion against the previous generation, against the boomer generation. Hang on one second. I have to get a drink there. I had to cover it up so you can't see, so there's no copyright infringement. I'm not sure how all these rules work yet. But the me generation was really pronounced against the boomer generation. And so is Generation X. As it goes on, that pronouncement doesn't become quite as avid, but the first one did, and you had it being okay to be a Republican. And the reason why it was okay to be a Republican was because it was against the ideals of the previous generation, where the previous generation was peace and love. This generation was more about what I can get out of the deal. And that was the me generation. That's why it was called Generation Me, because it was a generation based on greed. And you had some hippies kind of change over to that, but it was really kind of the later hippies. Like if you were a teenager or an early teen like in 1969, you may have become a me generation. But if you were like in your 20s, or something like that in 1969, you definitely, you were the person who tried to carry these ideologies over into the next generation. Your boomer ideologies. Now, and this also brings up too, because another show that was really popular in the 80s that had this pronouncement was Family Ties. And Family Ties, you had this huge pronouncement because the parents in the show were hippies, but Alex P. Keaton was this avid Republican, which you don't even see that in shows anymore. I mean, Republicans, just for a lot of people, it's just this bad word, right? It's just like, oh my gosh. But during that time, it was okay because that was what was the rebellion against this big democratic movement that was in a lot of ways bound up in the hippie movement. But this leads us to ask another question. And Alex is all into business, and he's going to go to Wall Street, and he's going to be a banker, and he's going to make money, and his life revolves around money, and he wants to protect the interest of money. And so, I remember one time, like very later in the series, where you had Andrew was born, the youngest son, and he was helping out Andrew's class, and he talked about people who want to take your money and how they're called Democrats, and the only thing that he was telling these little kids this, and it says, and the only thing that can help you is a Republican, and anyway, so he made the Republicans out to be heroes, and now the reason why there was such a pronouncement between the boomer generation, the hippie generation, and this new generation called Generation Me, which kind of morphed into Generation X, what was due to the fact that there was a sharp contrast and failure, abject failure of the hippie movement. Now, if I say that, people are going to go nuts. Oh, you can't believe it. You're saying that the hippies failed or the ideology failed or something like that. Look, I'm just a guy expressing his opinion, okay? Get over it. Get over it if that's what you're thinking. Just get over it. But let me just say this. Let me kind of go back and kind of walk through this a little bit and see how this was expressed in culture and movies, because it was expressed in TV shows. And that's kind of the idea here, is this idea between the hippie movement and the me generation was expressed now in 21 Jump Street, which I watched, and then really expressed in Family Ties. So you must remember that the hippie movement was an ideological movement. Okay, so let's just start there. Now, whether you agree with the ideology of the hippie movement or you disagree with the ideology of the hippie movements is not really important right now. But it was an ideological movement, and they wanted to spread their version of peace and love, bound up in the free expression of taking drugs and sexual promiscuity. Okay, that was their idea of how they were of what it meant to spread peace and love, and people living together and giving up identities and things like that. They just wanted to express this idea of peace and love and harmony among all people. But they believed that how they would accomplish this is they believed that how they would accomplish this is through drug use and free sex. Now, there may have been other avenues as well, but that was the idea. You have to give up the ideologies of the past, particularly the Christian ideologies of the past, and embrace this new generation where all that was just bound up in orthodoxy, and you just need to get over it, and those people were all selfish people, and we're going to be a giving generation. Now, of course, I'm summarizing greatly, but what's interesting is these people did drugs, and they were called the counterculture movement, but they did drugs as an ideology. Drugs was not just an escape for them. Drugs was an ideology for them. They really believed that drugs was going to be the answer. They even said that if to tune in or tune out and turn on, kind of a thing. And they were going to put. They even talked about, if this works, we're going to put drugs in the water. Because they wanted everybody to have this euphoric peace and for everybody to get along. And you got to remember that there was, that war was happening, and then the Vietnam War, and they didn't want people dying, and so they wanted peace, and it was a peace as opposed to war. Well, they found out, and very quickly. And you can even trace this back further to the beatniks, of course. But they found out very quickly that this didn't work. That this was that this failed. Okay, that this failed. And the reason why it failed is multifaceted, but they admitted that it failed. Look, even Rolling Stone came out and said that the dream is dead. 1969 was over, the 1970s came, and they said the dream was dead. Now, if you're young and you're ideological and something dies for you, and this was something that was beyond you, okay, so these people were actually living for, at least this was the claim. Whether or not the claim's genuine or not, that's another discussion. But at least the claim was that they were living for something greater than themselves, okay? But when that dream died, that created kind of this split. And you can see this split in movies, and you can see this split in music, you can see this split in television shows. And actually this split is kind of the foundation of what I talked about last time in the Star Wars episode, how the Star Wars brought everything. Some of the ideals in Star Wars was this very black and white kind of thing. But here was the split. Okay, let me just, and I'll tell you some of the expressions where you can see this split. The dream died. They realized that this wasn't going to happen, that this ideology of peace and harmony and love was not going to happen. But when the dream dies, then what do? Where are you left in that narrative? And people turned to two places. People turned to drug use as an escape mechanism rather than an ideology. They turned to drugs as a party enhancement idea. That was one expression of what they did, and that was probably best expressed in like the disco culture. So disco was very into excess, okay, very into, and you started seeing now, instead of a minimalistic expression of makeup, you saw a maximalistic expression of makeup. So it was the opposite of what the previous generation did. Instead of pared down type of clothing, where it's like, your bell-bottom jeans and your t-shirt and a tie-dye t-shirt and, this iconic kind of hippie look. It was gold. It was fancy. It was all dressed up. So that, you see, that was a rebellion against the ideology that failed them. And when an ideology fails you, you tend to rebel against that ideology. So that was the first thing that happened. You had this ideology that failed you. And then that one group that came out of this failure of this ideology was what could be best expressed in this not hippie culture, sorry, in the disco culture, which died out real quickly. There were more than one culture though, but let me just say two of the most pronounced cultures. The second most pronounced culture of that time would have been, and this now we're getting, because it takes a while to have something new form, not a terribly long time. We're talking within the first, like, 5, 6, 7 years, somewhere around that. By the end of the 70s, you have all full on board a bunch of people who are me generation people. And the second people who are just trying to, enhance the party and have excess. The second group of people was the people who are mad, like they're more defined by what they dislike. And that was probably best expressed in the punk rock movement. And what did you see in the punk rock movement was a lot of hate. People in punk rock were like, no, we hate you. Don't tell me these ideologies of the 60s. We're mad. It was a very kind of angry movement. You could feel the anger in their music. Their music is very, very angry. And then that, which I'll get into later, because one of the podcasts I'm going to talk about is underground music, but that led to what was called underground music, because that was a flash in the pan. Great artists, but it burned out really quickly, and burned out really quickly for a lot of different reasons. It burned out really quickly because of the industrial complex of record companies. That's one of the reasons it burned out real quickly. But I'll save that for another podcast. But let me just say that was the other rebellious thing that happened. But hate seems to kind of burn itself out real quickly. So that movement went underground, and then what you had was this disco movement, which also kind of burned out quickly, which is kind of funny, but for other reasons. But it was a movement of excess. And then as you translate into the 80s from that late 70s, and you have these movements into the 80s, and you can hear it in the music and you can hear it in the television shows, they started becoming self-focused by the latter half of the 70s, this of course. And as I said, as you can see this in the hippie movement, they started to become very self-focused. It was no longer, how am I going to spread peace and love to another generation or the rest of the world or whatever. It was, how am I going to gratify myself maximalistically? Okay, how am I going to gratify myself maximalistically? And here's the deal. Whether you're doing drugs because you hate the world, or you're doing drugs because you're trying to enhance the party, you realize that those forms of hedonism don't last for very long, and they're actually very self-destructive. But you want to keep the self going. Okay, so what's the one thing that you can turn to that can feed you? You feed your ego, feed yourself, but also propagate your life further. And it wasn't like drugs were totally erased. I mean, one of the big drugs that came out during that time was cocaine, where instead of being a downer and a psychedelic, it was an upper, So this is, again, part of the rebellion of this next generation. So it was this upper rather than this downer, and I'm down and all this, and I'm out and I'm having these psychedelic visions. Now you have cocaine, which was an upper, which was the opposite of what that gave you. Anyway, I was kind of going off there to express the contrast between the me generation and the boomer and the hippie generation. But so I lost my train of thought there for a second. Let me just go back. Okay, yeah, so money. Money is not your crass hedonism that burns itself out. Money is an avenue in which you can line your pockets and you can have enough to create what's called quantitative hedonism or Epicurean hedonism. And Epicurean hedonism is just enough. It's like it's excess for sure, but it's excess with the idea of extending my good time rather than burning my good time out, which is what happened with the other two. The other two kind of burned the good time out very quickly, but it was excess. So this turned into the me generation. And then you saw this me generation everywhere. You saw it particularly in music, where the 70s, the disco, I would say you'd see that. You wouldn't see it so much in punk, but you also saw it in new wave music. And then you also saw it in the television shows. And this kind of brings me around full circle to what I was talking about, where you have your Alex P. Keaton. And who was Alex P. Keaton? Well, he was a young Republican. And he wasn't the modern Republican where, this idea of conservative compassionism, which was brought on, which was advocated by Bush, but he was a hedonistic Republican, a Republican bent on making as much money as possible so that he could have the best life possible. And it turned from idealism, well, I should say this, they're both idealistic, but it turned into a very materialistic, self-materialistic emanation of this idea that is best expressed, television-wise in Family Ties. And so what was he? Again, his parents are all hippies. They're just freaked out that their son is into Reagan and Reaganomics, but the son's all into making money and living, like a king for as long as he can. He wasn't into drugs. That wasn't part. I think there was one episode where he took speed or something like that, and he failed the test, and he's all looking for, and his parents have to pull, so and even that, see, the drug use was there to, it wasn't like he was smoking pot and relaxing. He was taking speed so he could do better on a test. I don't know if you remember that episode of Family Ties. But that was one of those episodes. So even his drug use was a result of his ideology, and the ideology was to do good on a test. And why do you want to do good on a test? Well, because you want to get a good job, because that's the best way to maximize self-pleasure. And self-pleasure is the ultimate goal, not spreading peace and love. So that's what I learned from watching 21 Jump Street and reflecting on 21 Jump Street and Family Ties. Now, I will probably be talking more about this in the future. As I said, I'm going to be talking about underground music here in just a bit. And as I talk about underground music, I'll be kind of going through this again, but following the music trend on this more. Another, as long as I'm talking music and me generation, remember the very first generation of music videos that were really popular was New Wave. And the reason why New Wave was so there's reasons why New Wave was popular. I'm not going to get into here, but one of the things about New Wave is it was very much, instead of guitar, it was all synth pop. There was guitar, but the emphasis was synth pop, bands like Flock of Seagulls. Well, why? Well, you're not the Joni Mitchell anymore playing the guitar. You're not the Beatles in a band anymore, with instruments. What you are is you're in a band that's synth pop. And that was a result of this me generation, and this me generation being different. But the other thing they did was it was excess. I mean, you look at what they looked like, and it wasn't this pared down. It was very much, how would I say this? Not the same kind of makeup, but very much at least the same flair as the disco movement. okay? The same flair as the disco movement. The disco movement was excessive, as I said before. You know, you're dressing up in gold and big hair and all this stuff. Well, look at the new wave movement. Big hair, lots of makeup, and then of course we can talk. I already talked about hair metal in another one, which I don't want to get into again here. But the Me generation. The Me generation was that first generation of Generation X and the last generation of the hippie generation, who were burnt out on the idea and felt to a degree betrayed by the failure of the hippie ideology, and went to live for themselves rather than trying to spread the ideas of peace and love. And that's just my take on the situation as an observer of the past. So, hey, thanks for tuning in. I look forward to doing more of these episodes. Again, we're going to be talking about, this was kind of lofty up there, but we're going to be talking more about like pop culture kind of stuff. This was a little ideological, a little lofty, a little philosophical, but it's important. You had the hippie generation, you had the Me generation, you had Generation X, you have Zennials and Millennials, and the next time will be a little bit more, I think it'll be in depth, but it'll be a little bit more focused on the pop culture and underground of those generations. So if you like what you heard here, please, please, please hit that subscribe button, whether you're on YouTube. Now, if you're listening to this on podcast, please go over to YouTube. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, please go over to podcast. But let me tell you something. On YouTube, I am going to be having some content as the shows go on that are going to be exclusive to YouTube, okay? So you're going to want to head over there, and I'll let you know on the podcast platform of this if there is stuff on YouTube. And don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Please share this on your favorite social media. It would really mean a lot to me. And don't forget to click the links below if you're interested in helping the show out. I'm going to be linking to Buy Me a Coffee, which is kind of like a Patreon thing where you can share funds and help me do this more often and better quality. I just got a new camera, a new microphone, so I hope this works better than the last one. And I'm going to be getting some new and professional podcasting equipment, but I'd really like to do this professionally as a job, and you play a part in that. And I thank you for whatever part you play. So we will talk to you again soon. And again, I hope you enjoyed this episode. We will see you later.